a lot of things that are happening geographically. For example, you remember the Red Sea was closed at the Suez Canal. Now there's a Strait of Hormuz that's also going through challenges that you cannot control. So COVID happened, and then my role was let go because Uber wanted to focus on the rides business versus focusing on the e-bikes and scooters business. Everybody can dream. Everybody dreams big. A lot of times, our lived experiences are very different. You may think that if I work hard in the next 3 to 5 years based on where I am now, I should be able to get to that position I'm dreaming of. I, on the other hand, may sometimes need to knock on doors. I may need to break down doors. I may need to tear down biases. My GE story about the 9 times in 2 years where I applied to General Electric and the 9 times that I was rejected and I got.
All right, welcome back everyone to a new episode of Business Unbound, the show where we dive into conversations with visionary leaders from every corner of the globe to bring you insights, inspiration, and the real stories behind success. I'm your host, Florian Hoff. Today, I'm joined by Harry Davies. Harry is a leader in global supply chain and logistics. He has been the global transportation strategy and sourcing manager at Cisco, where he helped shape how ground and parcel transportation is managed across EMEA and the Americas. Before that, Harry was at Tesla, where he led transportation sourcing for finished vehicles across EMEA, managing a category spend of roughly $400 million. Earlier in his career, Harry handled high-stakes customs and logistics in oil and gas. He's also currently pursuing an executive MBA degree at the University of Oxford. In today's conversation, Harry and I will explore the moves that took him from warehouse and customs roles in Ghana to global procurement in Western countries and in Europe in particular. We then go very practical into supply chain matters and sourcing, and we explore where the money and the risk really sit and what good tender preparation looks like before you talk to a single supplier. Now, if you've ever wondered how to negotiate when prices jump overnight, how to build contracts that survive, tariffs and capacity shocks as we are seeing right now, or how to spot whether a logistics team's savings are real or just slides, this episode will give you frameworks, questions, and tactics you can use immediately. Whether you're a business leader engaged with sourcing and supply chain matters, running operations, or stepping into a bigger role in an organization that deals with physical products, this conversation will deliver masterclass level insights into an area that is now more than ever impacted by enormous geopolitical disruptions. This is Business Unbound. Let's dive in. Quick moment of honesty. Business Unbound is brand new. We are in the early days of something that I genuinely believe in, a show dedicated to real conversations with forward-thinking business leaders and inspiring individuals who are having a real impact on this world. And that's where you come in. I need your help. If you're watching this on YouTube, please like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. If you're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any podcast app, please follow the show and leave a rating. It sounds simple, but it shows the algorithms that this content matters, and it directly impacts how many ambitious professionals like you discover these conversations. When you're helping me, you're not just supporting the show. Here's what you're really doing. You're saying that quality business conversations deserve a platform. You're saying substance matters over hype, and you're saying this mission is worth building. So if this resonates with you, help me reach others like you. Subscribe, follow, and share whatever works for wherever you are. You're helping me build something substantial from the ground up, and I genuinely appreciate it. So thank you. And now back to the show. Harry Davies, welcome to Business Unbound.
Thank you so much, Florian, for having me on your podcast.
I'm super glad that you're joining me today. And Harry, when someone outside supply chain and sourcing is asking you what you actually do, how do you explain this in plain English?
Well, so to the typical person who would normally ask me what I do, I try to break it down in buckets. So I tell them supply chain is literally, before any material item is made, it needs to go through a process before it's made, and then before it goes to the final customer who needs that material. So for example, if you need a laptop, the laptop goes through a process, right? And in this process, you are thinking about what are the raw materials we need to buy to be able to make this laptop? And then after the laptop is produced, manufactured, then we also think about how do we deliver this to the final customer who sits in their home, clicks the button of a mouse, and then has the laptop delivered. So supply chain talks about the identification of a need, the manufacturing process, or the raw materials coming in to manufacture these products. And then after production, where do we store them? And then after storing them, how do we distribute them and deliver through to the final customer? So that end-to-end process that happens before a material is fully made and delivered to a consumer or a customer or a client that needs it. I tell them in plain English. But I narrow down specifically on the procurement side, which looks at normally what we are buying, selecting suppliers that we want to buy from, and building strategic relationships with them. And then beyond that, I also focus more on the logistics category, which would oftentimes also look at customs cross-border transportation, either by air, by road, by ocean or rail, and then even the last mile delivery, where it's coming delivered through a parcel service. It could be a FedEx or UPS or DHL that would bring the package to your home. This is the area that I focus on, and that's my everyday work.
Right. And from what I'm understanding, this is one of the areas which is currently the most heavily impacted by all sorts of geopolitical disruptions, by tariffs. What do you see when you look at what is happening in the world versus the line of work that you are active in?
Well, I think that there are a lot of things that are happening geographically. I mean, when you talk about geopolitics, that no one has control of, right? For example, you remember the Red Sea was closed at the Suez Canal. Now there's a Strait of Hormuz that's also going through challenges that you cannot control. There was COVID, where there was a lot of materials being produced, or raw materials, parts coming from Asia, but there were no vessels or there were no aircraft to be able to move them. So when you think about the geopolitical stuff, you think about the tariffs that are slapped on products coming from, let's say, certain countries, and then the counter tariffs that are slapped on them. And so now for us professionals, we are thinking, where is our primary source of sourcing, or areas where we buy from? Could we look at secondary locations so that in the event that there's a tariff, we find plans to mitigate that kind of risk by going to an alternative supplier in a different geolocation, or figuring out what kind of structured contracts we need to have so that as and when we have tariffs increases, we'll be able to figure out how we can balance between the buyer and the seller so that we kind of meet each other halfway through.
And before we dive into the particulars, I'm interested to learn a little bit more about your background and your story. Now, Harry, I understand from our pre-discussion that you're originally from Ghana. And well, forgive me if I'm potentially falling for, I would say, general conception, but apparently it's not super easy to migrate into major roles in Western countries when you're coming from countries such as Ghana or similar. Now, what responsibility did you have recently, say, working in EMEA or the Americas as part of your work that, let's say, early career Harry in Ghana would not have believed was possible?
Well, Florian, that's an interesting question. I'll break it down into two categories, right? So first of all, indeed, it's quite a challenge to find a role in Europe and relocate to Europe as someone coming from, quote and unquote, a third world country. So when I started my career basically in logistics freight forwarding, one of the key things, I worked for global multinationals. And so I had that sheer determination that I need to step out of my comfort zone and get into global zones. Why? Because I didn't want to be a local champ, but I wanted to get out into the world and get global perspectives, get different ideas, and be able to see the world as it is in terms of logistics and supply chain. So technically, I applied for a role in the Netherlands with Uber, and then I was hired. Thankfully, I was relocated at the time in 2019, and then brought into the Netherlands. And this is where my career, I would say, literally took off to the level it is now. But then, with regards to your question on what I do on a daily basis, yes, back in Ghana, I wasn't in a very typical senior position. I was in a very in the everyday operational role. So I'm building the SOPs. I'm looking at the everyday customs clearance. I'm looking at the transportation. Do we have a proof of delivery? And I'm daily communicating with our customers with regards to the status of their shipments. And so, although my background, I mean, I went to school to study procurement and supply. So I have an HND in procurement and supply. Then I went back to school to study freight forwarding with the Ghana Institute of Freight Forwarding, which is also affiliated to FIATA, which in Switzerland, which is the Global Federation of Freight Forwarders. So I call myself a global freight forwarder. And so initially, I thought my career would narrow down into procurement. And why I say this is because when I was in second year of school, I was among a few students that were chosen as part of a partnership between the Millennium Challenge account and the government of Ghana, because they wanted to build the next generation of procurement professionals who would work in government. And you literally do not study procurement in school. So the thought was giving us practical experience through internships so that you could churn out a generation that has practical experience and also has a classroom knowledge. So my plan was I'll narrow down into procurement. Unfortunately, I always ended up working in logistics or transportation. So managing air freight, managing customs brokerage, managing ocean freight, managing warehousing and storage, etc. So when I relocated to Europe, it became very easy for me because I had some perspective of how um, freight forwarding and logistics work. And I also need to mention that prior to my relocating to Europe, I lived in Ghana. I moved from Ghana after working for General Electric or GE Oil and Gas to Senegal in West Africa to improve my French speaking skills. And whilst in Senegal, I was fortunate enough to be hired by Maersk. At the time, Maersk wanted to be the global integrator of logistics. So I was hired as a product manager for warehouse and distribution, as well as customs house brokerage for Northern West Africa. So 7 countries in the cluster and based in Senegal. So it kind of happened in a flow, or I would say in a chronological sequence, because when I was hired by Uber, I was hired as a logistics program manager for Europe, Middle East, and Africa. So the trajectory started in Ghana, moved to Northwest Africa for Senegal, managing 7 countries in that cluster. And then I moved to managing Europe, Middle East, and Africa for Uber.
Right. Then you went to Uber. You were based in Europe, and from Uber to Tesla. Is that correct?
Yes, so I relocated to the Netherlands. I worked for Uber for 3 years. I was a logistics program manager responsible for the e-bikes and scooters, which has now been sold to Lime. So if you see Lime bikes all around Europe, some of them you would see Lime by Uber or Uber by Lime, one of them. So COVID happened, and then my role was let go because Uber wanted to focus on the rides business versus focusing on the e-bikes and scooters business. And since I came to the Netherlands as a skilled professional, then I had to find some roles, or I had to relocate back to Ghana. And obviously I didn't want to relocate. So I did a few stints, but the plan was from e-bikes, I should go to e-vehicles, so I did a few applications into Tesla that didn't work out for like a year. And then thankfully sometime 2 years ago, I got the role as a senior global supply manager for Europe, Middle East, and Africa for logistics procurement of the finished vehicles. In short, the role literally looked at all the vehicles of Tesla that were produced in the Gigafactory in Berlin. I was responsible for moving them by road. So I was sourcing for car transporting companies who would then go to Gigafactory Berlin. The cars will be loaded on them, and then they will be delivered or distributed across to Tesla's service centers within Europe, Middle East, and Africa.
So in other words, if I'm a customer in Dubai and I ordered a Tesla, this Tesla would have been likely produced in Berlin in the Gigafactory. And with your work, you would have been responsible for getting this Tesla from Berlin all the way to Dubai.
Absolutely. So again, depending on the model, so Berlin did most of the Model Y production. So if you wanted a Model Y, you would normally get it from Berlin. So there's also some intersections, right? So I had colleagues who were responsible for ocean freight sourcing. So I would normally transport the car if it was going to the Middle East from the factory to the port. And then my team or my colleague responsible for vessel coordination would have sourced for a space on a vessel. So maybe you're moving 20,000 cars on a vessel. Vessel arrives in the port in Middle East, right? And then once it arrives in the port in Middle East, then I'm again responsible for finding a local transporter or car transporter who would be able to pick the cars from the port, deliver to a service center, and then you walk into the service center and pick your car.
Now, Harry, I propose that we actually use this as a segue to dive a little bit deeper into the transportation and the sourcing systems. I'm really curious to learn from you who moves what, who gets paid, and who ultimately carries the risk. Because as a consumer, it's very easy to just assume, okay, you're just getting delivered what you're buying, or even as a business when you have a physical product and you're not so intimately involved into supply chain as you are, that maybe individuals take it as granted that physical products just magically appear, which is obviously not the case. So for our audience member, can you explain what global sourcing means in your terms, perhaps by using Tesla as an example, if you can, and really try to explain the value chain?
Yes. So, I mean, global sourcing is literally, in plain terms or in plain English, sourcing or buying from international suppliers mainly. So that's global sourcing. Sourcing, but then sourcing is more strategic, right? It goes into how do you identify suppliers? How do you build the relation? How do you onboard the suppliers? How do you check for the risk with the suppliers? How do you check their financial risk? How do you check their commercial expertise and experience before you onboard them? So generally, global sourcing is just that part where you buy from international suppliers. But I dare say that in these times, right, supply chain has become a very collaborative process, right? Because there's so many intersections and that's why we call it a supply chain. Different chains coming together to be able to create one loop of chain that looks at when we had a need through to when this was delivered to the final customer. And so in this collaborative approach, there are quite a lot of risks, right? And the risk could come from different aspects of the supply chain. So from a supply chain perspective, I do a risk assessment, and I'm able to evaluate where do I see a high level risk and how do I mitigate those risks, right? So I'll give an example. There could be a risk of a delay. And so if there's a risk of a delay, what do I do if there's a delay? If it's inventory that I need to hold, giving an example of cars or in the automotive industry, then I would say, do I have some buffer stock that I have so that at every point in time I have inventory and will be able to sell? Or what do I propose to a prospective customer to say, hey, due to this disruption, give us another week and we'll have your car delivered to you? There could also be the risk of maybe damages during transit, right? So you have a brand new car that is being delivered, and then by the time it arrives at destination, there could be possibility of damage. There could be dents, there could be scratches. And so being able to, again, mitigate those risks with your supplier to make sure that, okay, there's a damage. What do we do? We need to make sure we have parts ready on standby so we can quickly fix the damages. We need to be able to have a quick turnaround time when we are fixing these damages. That way, we don't have an impact on the customer because the customer needs to buy a brand new, wholesome car versus receiving a damaged package or damaged car. And then anything could also happen in transit. Something could get missing in between. And so, what are the kind of contracts you have? You think about the insurance risk, right? In the event of damage, in the event of quote and unquote, something we call force majeure, which is literally just saying that through an act of God, there is an accident, right? It could be some cars are on a vessel and then something happens. There's a bomb thrown in this war happening now. And so you want to make sure you have the right insurance in place to secure your cargo or have a backup plan. If there's damaged or missing shipment, you'd be able to get it back or be compensated well for that damage.
Mhm. And over the course of our conversation so far, I've heard a few terms which I think we should clarify a little bit further. We talked about ships, we talked about freight forwarders, we talked about other providers that sit somewhere in this logistical chain. And for our audience members, I feel it would be super helpful if you could perhaps explain, like almost as on a whiteboard, as if you were drawing the process, how a piece of goods, someone an aspect, let's say from China as a typical like starting location, perhaps. How does this particular piece move through the different parties all the way to, well, in our case, Europe?
Yes, so great question. Freight forwarding is literally the aspect of a service provider. A lot of some companies call them LSP or logistics service provider. So freight forwarding or your customs broker is the one that would normally be responsible for negotiating rates with, could it be an airline, could be a vessel, B, looking at when your shipment arrives at destination or even the export customs clearance. So you'd make sure you have a commercial invoice, you have a packing list. If you're shipping by air, you want to make sure that your airway bill is available. It has all the details. If you're shipping by ocean, you want to make sure that your bill of lading or your telex is available. If you're shipping by road, you want to make sure your ATR carnets are ready. And then you attach all these to your commercial invoice packing list. Let's just say that sometimes you may have some dangerous goods, right? So there are 9 classes of DG, and all modes of transport also have controls on how you move these dangerous goods. So by air, we have the IATA or International Air Transport Association regulations, which is the category 6. By ocean, we have the IMDG, International Maritime Transport of Dangerous Goods. That's all give you the regulations on how you move dangerous goods or hazardous goods. Now, typical example from China, let's say to Europe. So to draw the chain, I would say maybe I want to buy a car from China, right? So I'm just trying to see how I'll draw the boxes. There could be a car manufacturing organization in China that says I have produced 20,000 cars that needs to be transported to Europe. That is box number 1. So box number 2 is where you have a procurement professional who could be me or who could be my peer who is responsible for sourcing space availability on a ship or on a vessel. So he goes to the different kinds of shipping lines. And again, I used to work for Maersk, so maybe a Maersk buyer. So you go to Maersk or MSC or DP World and say, hey, I've got 20,000 cars that needs to move to Europe. Would you have availability on your vessel? They could say, yes, we have. And typically we use what we call a roll vessel. So roll literally means roll on, roll off. So it's easy to move cars on it. They arrive at the port and they get off. So this procurement professional now negotiates with the shipping organization that says, I have 20,000, they negotiate on the rates, and then they have different terms. Now, some of the terms could be that when you arrive at a destination, the shipping line is responsible for unloading the cars out of the vessel. Okay. Or you could decide that I have a local vessel agency, or you could decide that the ports and terminals where the vessel has arrived, you're going to contract with them. So the vessel just arrives in the port, you've contracted with a local port and terminal, they go in, remove all the 20,000 cars. Now, when you remove the 20,000 cars, you temporarily store them in the terminal. So you also have a procurement person who is responsible for negotiating for the space or the capacity within the terminals and the ports, right? So the cars are there, and then you could have a third party also come in who you have sourced to do the checking, check if the cars are running, do cleaning, polishing, and everything to make sure the cars are safe. Then you have me as a procurement for finished vehicle transportation coming, where I have contracted and gone on a long-term agreement with a car transporting company. So the car transporting company, let's say I've agreed with them that in the whole year, I may have 1 million cars coming in through this port, but the capacity per day is X number when a vessel arrives. So this car transporting company now begins to liaise with the vessel company as well as the ports and terminal company. So they begin to exchange information to say, when the vessel comes, we'll get it off at this time. If you have your trucks ready, we may be able to get it onto the trucks within 24 hours. So based on, the port's capacity, there's also what we call the demurrage, right? So when you offload in the terminal, maybe the port authority says, and the terminal authority says, we give you 24 hours free, manage your customs brokerage, customs clearance. So depending on where the cars are coming from, let's say because of all this geopolitical stuff, the cars are coming from China, like we said in the example, then it's important that your freight forwarder or your customs broker comes in and says 20,000 cars are in, what are the taxes, what are the duties that are required to be paid? So he facilitates and coordinates all these things. And then my position as a procurement for logistics comes in to move all these cars to the final destination, which could be a delivery center, could be a distribution center, and then this will be delivered on there. So in a typical transportation schedule, this is how it works. Now, based on the contractual agreements, then you want to get to the invoicing aspect. So the vessel company now comes to my peer that's sourced for capacity and says, 20,000 is going to cost you X amount. Now, based on the terms you had with them, so for example, you said if you arrive at the port and you manage the offloading of the vessel, I'm going to charge you X amount per VIN or per car. So if that was included in the ocean freight lump sum, which is the cost of the voyage, it's included. If that's not included, you only pay them for the voyage. And then the ports and terminals company comes in and says, this is how much it is going to cost you for getting the 20,000 vessels out, storing it temporarily in our facility. They also share their invoice. The car transportation company comes in and says, we've already agreed with you that it's going to cost you $300 per car if we move them out of the port. And so sometimes, depending on the size of the car, a car transporter could load maybe 6, 7, 8 on it based on also the local regulations per the countries where the cars would be moving in. So trying to also make sure that you stay within those specific regulations. And then you deliver to the service center and then the customer goes in to pick it. So the customers on the back end do not see what we do, that coordinated effort to make sure that the car is manufactured in China, but a lot of different things go in within the back end to be able to make sure that the car is delivered in a showroom where they just go in and pick up their cars. So that's how complex, I'm just trying to summarize the complexity of the end-to-end delivery of a car coming from Asia or China into Europe.
It does sound complex, and let me be a little bit provocative here, perhaps. Can AI not take over the whole process?
So yes and no. I mean, when I say yes, I feel like, imagine you have 20,000 vehicles and all of them have individual identification numbers. So imagine the commercial invoice you're going to have. Imagine the packing list. Imagine the bill of lading. And then also imagine that it's got lithium ion batteries, right? So it means they are class 9 dangerous goods. And where you have 20,000 vehicles in one space, you are also very intentional. I think maybe the last couple of years, there was an incident where a vessel drowned carrying some cars that's, it's all the lithium ion batteries, the class 9 dangerous goods that were in there. And it's important that when you have dangerous goods, you also have what we call the MSDS, or a material safety data sheet, which literally governs you on how to transport, how to pack, where to store, etc. Now with AI, you can use AI in sourcing for the vessel company. So you can use AI to shortlist suppliers for you when you give them specific parameters. I need a vessel that has a company that has vessels with capacity of 20K and above. I need a company that has vessels that are able to call specific ports, right? Because sometimes the 20,000 cars will be delivered across 4 countries. So 10,000 delivered in, let's say, the Netherlands, 5,000 delivered in Germany, and then subsequently other ports that you have. And so you can use AI in your contractual process. I agree, because it's also going to help you with can you imagine the different contracts we are signing, right? My peer who is getting the space on the voyage has a contract with the shipping company. I would have a contract with the car transporting company. My peer who is responsible for ports and compounds are locations where, let's say, cars are stored, would also have different contracts in place. So using AI to sort of help you co-term your contracts so they would all end around the same time, so you can negotiate and look at how you can bundle them together. You can do the shortlisting or even the final contracts, the legal terms, the warranties, the liabilities, and all that. It can help you fine-tune and streamline them. But beyond that, you need someone to drive the cars out of the vessel. AI will not be able to do that. Beyond that, you want to be able to also leverage AI in what we call our market intelligence or market research data. How do I mean by this? So if you go to 3 companies who own vessels and you tell them you've got 20,000 cars, you want to have market intelligence data that gives you how much is the cost from moving a voyage from China to Europe, right? Or how much is the cost for car transporting from the port of Rotterdam to Germany? Because there are so many suppliers who can provide the same service, but how do you ensure you benchmark the price to know that you're paying the right amount? And this is where AI is helping with the market intelligence, the market research. So when I'm going to negotiate, I've already done my research with AI that, hey, from destination A to this zone in this country or this zip code in that country, what is the price? It's going to calculate the price per kilometer for you because it's going to give you the full length of the kilometer. Then it's going to do a breakdown. Okay, this is the cost for the equipment. This is the cost for driver. This is the cost for road toll. If you have to go into a ferry, it will help you with all these intricacies, and then it will break it down. So you know that the price per kilometer on a 200-kilometer journey is, let's say, $3. So that when the supplier comes to you and says, I'm going to charge you $6, you say that, well, that's not realistic. That is not what the data on the market is saying. So AI has a part to play in helping you with the market intelligence, market dynamics for you to make a meaningful decision.
Right. And in this picture that you've painted, right, the different parties involved with AI or without AI, I'm wondering a little bit, where does the real money sit and where does the risk primarily lie?
That's a very interesting question. Normally, it doesn't. Supply chain is a very collaborative approach, so it doesn't actually look at where the money sits, right? And where the money sits would normally come down to what is the cost of the goods sold, right? And if I want to get to the cost of the goods sold, I also want to get the landed cost. What do I mean by this? The car is manufactured in Berlin. So I need to look at what is the landed cost when it arrives in Southampton Port. So this is the cost of the voyage. I know this cost. Now in Southampton, let's say it's the car, when we make up the car, blah, 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 blah. So the car now costs 20,000 at manufacture in Berlin. When it arrives in Southampton, it's now, let's say, 20,500. Now, I also need to look at all other in between. So there's customs clearance, there's all these operational costs, there's the car transportation to the final destination, going to the Midlands or going to the north of the UK, etc. So from a procurement standpoint, I'm able to calculate the landed cost. Then I can pass it on to the sales team. Sales team can also look at all the operational costs of the 20,000 plus every other thing in between and decide that, well, the cost of goods sold is X amount. Our markup, our margin, whatever that we need to add on top of it would be Y amount. And then we are selling the car at Z. Right. So the cost doesn't necessarily sit in a specific location, but some costs are very, what's the right word to use? They're very cost intensive, maybe for want of a better word, because it's really a complex cycle of moving certain parts. So a raw material coming from somewhere could be very expensive. Batteries coming from somewhere could be very expensive. So I think that cost doesn't sit in one area, but it's just using the impact of what's the cost of goods sold from a supply chain standpoint will be able to help you look at the impacts on the number of goods that you sold and how it reflects on the EBITDA on your balance sheet. And I'm trying to bring in Oxford terminology from my accounting class because I did now understand the cost of goods sold and what I could do from a procurement standpoint to be able to come to the real cost, which includes all the direct, indirect cost all coming together. Now, you spoke about risk, and the complexity of risk is very, very diverse across supply chain, right? It could happen that an important raw material could not be delivered to you because of your tier 2 or tier 3 supplier that could not deliver. So from a procurement standpoint, that's why I say that procurement is now very strategic and collaborative. So I'm thinking, how do I go into long-term agreements with my supplier? And how do I ensure that my supplier is also going into long-term agreements with its tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 suppliers? So that in the event of any risk that supplier B cannot deliver, and so my tier 1 supplier won't be able to provide, we've already have buffer stock or we already have a contingency plan. So that also means that there's been a lot of shift on having primary and secondary suppliers to provide you your raw material. So when I say having primary and secondary, I would normally typically say that I'll give 80% of the contract to supplier A, who is a primary. And then in order to keep the relationship with supplier B, I'll give them 20%. So that in the event that a tier 2 supplier cannot provide to my primary, when I go to the secondary supplier, I can say, hey, the capacity was 20%. Now, can you move it to 50%? And because I've been giving them something, they can quickly ramp up and then be able to provide to make up for the deficits that primary supplier is not able to provide. So this is how, we are being strategic in supply chain with regards to, the relationship you build with your suppliers, the contracts you go into. So if I'm giving you a long-term contract of 5 years, I want to see that you have similar, if not same contract with your tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers, so that at every point in time, you know that, and it also helps even the tier 2, tier 3 suppliers to know that, oh, this is our major supplier to company B, and then they have a long-term contract. We also have a long-term contract, so we know that there'll always be that business continuity.
This sounds all fascinating to me, right? And I'm from an industry where we work with tangible goods. I focus a lot on services like financial services, banking, insurance, and these questions they typically come never up because they are not something to worry about on a daily basis. But obviously, there are many companies that deal with physical aspects of products that are being delivered. Now, let's see how
I need to chip something in here. As you mentioned, you come from the financial services industry.
Yeah.
So I'm a procurement professional, and some of what I do is I actually procure professional services. So you may not see, I'm not buying tangible goods, but I'm buying services. So we always say that procurement is sourcing goods, services, and goods and services and everything in between from whichever supplier. So I could come to a McKinsey, I could come to a Bain and Co, and I could run a tender and select which of them our company would work with. I would come to a big four and I'll be looking for a company to help us audit our firm for the next financial year or the next couple of financial years. And it will amaze you that I come to you and negotiate with you. Your partners will tell me our rates are $500 per hour. I'm negotiating. Can we do $400 per hour? So in as much as, when you work in those professional services, you're not in everyday manufacturing where they are tangible goods. As procurement professional, we also source the soft services as well.
And this is something that I can definitely relate to. I've been in, countless situation where we, of course, have been also negotiating with the purchasing department and with procurement, right? And I've been referring particularly to the physical categories, right? Which some goods definitely have. And let's see, Harry, if we can put our listeners in a real situation. So assume the following. They are joining an organization, a company, or partnering with one or investing in them. So they have like a significant exposure to this particular organization. And this organization itself has significant costs related to transportation or transportation related services. So to make it very practical, I mean, you worked for the company, but assume you wanted to buy Tesla, right? You wanted to buy Tesla, and I understand from you that transportation is significant to Tesla. Now, how would you be able to figure out what is actually going on and to determine whether or not there's an issue that you would need to be aware of?
Yes. So, I mean, if I was joining a company, I mean, there are some questions that definitely I would love to ask, because I I want to be able to understand the value I could bring into the organization. So, I mean, typically I'm going to ask, hey, what is our spend for the last, let's say, 1 to 2 years, right? What is the transportation spend? And then also, what is the impact of our spend on our balance sheet? Is it significant? Is it very important? Because once it is very important, then you know that, okay, this is something that organization takes seriously. As well, you also want to understand the impact of contracts that you have. When I say the impact of contract that we have, do you just have short-term contracts every 6 months you need to renew, or do you have long-term strategic contracts? I think more on a long-term strategic contract, because then you are able to build something with your prospective vendor or supplier or logistics service provider, because it's very capital intense. And so people need to invest. We need to buy trucks. Your suppliers need to buy trucks. They need to hire labor, i.e. drivers, etc. So they definitely would want to see something long term that is happening. And then also you may think of asking your prospective manager to kind of walk you through a typical example when there was a delay by, let's say, 48 hours. And then just take a seat back and now listen to what they have to say. Because based on the responses that you get from the organization that you're possibly going to work for, it helps you understand, A, who are the movers and the shakers? Who are the strategic partners that I need to make sure I have them at my back? It could come from leadership, right? So leadership has the budget, or it could come from the finished vehicle team because they own the budget. So I'm buying for this team. Then you can also understand that if this is what the impact is on our EBITDA, on our balance sheet, whatever, then you're also thinking, what value can I bring in? Can I renegotiate prices so that we can reduce cost? Can I reduce even the number of suppliers? So when I come in there from procurement, we're looking for strategic partners. We're not looking for 1,000 partners to work for us as an organization. And some of the organizations I've worked for, I came in where we had so many suppliers. And when I went into the spend dashboard, I realized maybe there could be a supplier that in the last 5 years, the spend with them is 10,000 or 20,000 or 100,000 euros or dollars. These are not strategic. So I'm looking at how do I eliminate these suppliers to reduce the number? And then the lesser number I have, I can go into strategic relationship, long-term relationships with them. That way, we can be able to understand the impact of the logistics role or the procurement of logistics services within the organization. I don't know if it answers your question.
Yeah, let me ask a follow-up perhaps. I understand that you've obviously been involved in very high stakes and high value purchasing decisions that were made. I think I read somewhere that for Tesla, you managed a spend of about 400 million US dollar per year. You were involved in this. And this is obviously a high stakes decision, as there's like, or many individual high stakes decisions that accumulate to this $400 million spend. In very practical terms, what is your decision-making framework that you apply to determine whether or not there is a supplier where it's worthwhile to enter into a strategic relationship or not?
Yeah. So it's important to mention that before you go into any long-term you go into any long-term agreements or partnership with a supplier, you need to run a procurement process. You need to run a tendering process. So what I normally do, or I would normally do, is I go to my internal stakeholders. Could be the finished vehicle team, could be the operations team, who all come together, and I say, what are your biggest challenges? What are your headaches, right? That if I had a logistics service provider, you would want for them to solve for you. So with them, I'm able to build my scope of work. Also knowing technically that they own the budget for the spend. Once I have this information, I also go and look at what is the work that needs to be done. So how many lanes do we have, right? So there are lanes. When I talk about lanes, it's, let's say, from Germany to the Netherlands. Those could be strategic lanes because maybe we move a lot of cars, as an example, on those specific lanes. So you're able to break down the number of lanes, which are the most recurring lanes, which are the most strategic lanes that are very important to you. When I have this, I also have the spend. Then I also think about, what do I really want my 3PL partner to do on a strategic level? So I sit together internally with my internal stakeholders and I think, is the organization growing? Yes. So the strategy would be, do we do destination to zone or destination to zip? So when I say destination to zip, it means that we are picking, let's say, as an example, we are picking the car from Berlin and we are delivering to this zip where we have like a delivery center. But if I see that we are growing, I'm looking at what is the frequency of growth in the last 2 years. And I see that within this zip, maybe 20 kilometers away, we also created a new distribution center. So then I think the strategy would be from origin to an area. So when I say an area could be a wide geographical area where, if I go into contract with these third-party logistics service providers and say that this is the rate for this area, in between, if after 1 year we create a new distribution center within that area, I don't need to go and run a new tender or RFQ anymore because it's within a specific geographical location and the price would be the same. So being able to kind of demarcate those kind of things is very important. Now, when you run the RFQ, you also have a team that helps you with the selection. So there's a commercial and the financial component of the RFQ. So normally from a procurement standpoint, you focus a lot on the financial, but you also want to make sure that the operational aspect or the commercial aspect of the service they're going to provide, you bring the technocrats. These are the operational team. So they will now come in and help you and say, we like this, we want this, this is non-negotiable. We need to make sure that they have got an insurance coverage of up to 1 million. We need to make sure that they have branches all around. They have a strategy for cabotage, right? So cabotage is literally saying that if the car or if the truck is not from Germany, it can do 3 deliveries into Germany and must exit Germany and wait for maybe 4 days before it can go in, so that the local German car tracking companies would also have business. So you have to be specific, because if they go contrary to cabotage rules, a car could be grounded, which means that if a truck is grounded and you have cars sitting on it, you cannot deliver to your specific customers. So you build all these commercial conversations, negotiations, and then you are able to work with your internal stakeholders of which ones are non-negotiable. So they tell you, okay, this is non-negotiable. Okay, then we put what we call the weighting. So what weight do we put on quality? What weight do we put on damage? What weight do we put on the cost of pricing, right? So let's say pricing is 30% of the overall cost of transportation. Let's say quality aspect, damage, fuel surcharges, etc. All these things come in. So in the round one, you have like a checkbox where you're able to filter down into what I call the long list, because there's, let's say, 50 people, 50 suppliers or companies that have shown interest in the tender, and you need to sort of long list them to about 10. And then you go into a round 2 where you focus on the price. You ask for them to revert with their pricing again. And then when they come back, then you do like another shortlist. And then within this shortlist, you decide, okay, can you come and present to us your solution? So you have internal stakeholders sit with you. This 3PO parties would come in, propose their solutions. You understand their solutions, the complexity. Do they solve your pain points into why you need a transport service provider? Once they do, and you're okay with the pricing, or you're not okay with the pricing, then of course, from my part, we go into a proper negotiation where we discuss, okay, we want the price per VIN, price model, or we want the price per distance model. So it depends on countries, it depends on scope, and then you decide on whether you want the price per VIN, price per commute, and then you're able to negotiate those agreements. Once you accept that, this is where you also go in. Simultaneously, as you're negotiating, you are asking them to also redline the contract. So this is where you bring your legal team, because you don't want to wait till the end of the process before you ask them to redline, where redlining, sometimes the conversation with legal can take up to 2-3 months. So you launch it at the same time you launch the RFQ. So the redline, your legal team also goes in with you. So those, from a commercial standpoint, you bring your inputs. From a legal standpoint, the legal advises you. You have all the back and forth. And so by the time you run the tender, you also have the contracts ready. And then whichever one you decide to go with, you're able to contract and sign.
That's a very sophisticated process that you just explained.
Indeed. It's quite a sophisticated approach.
It is, and in all honesty, Harry, I feel like we have covered a lot of ground already, right? And this has been, I would say, partially technical, and it covered many of the more like intricate aspects that a professional working in this field like you is exposed to on a daily basis. And at the same time, I also feel like there were some valuable points that more leadership personnel and senior managers should understand and probably can understand reasonably to help their organization make more informed decisions about, well, important matters such as where do we allocate spend, how can we optimize spend, what is important, how do we structure a tender process, etc. Perhaps let's...
So to add to that, when you speak about senior management, obviously senior management also owns the budget. So I'll give an example. Normally in the automotive industry, right, you have your car transporting companies, and you've given them the maximum capacity that they could provide. How do you do this? You also, if you want to be competitive, you're asking them, if I'm asking you to deliver to me in Berlin, do they have cargo or load coming back in the opposite direction? Because if they do have, or if you can give them volumes in the opposite direction, it helps with negotiating the price rate. So this is also an impact that procurement can provide to the organization. But then if all your contracted car carriers are at full capacity, and then you have end of quarter where you sell more cars, then you need to buy on a spot basis, right? So the spot basis is, I have in excess of 6,000 cars, and I need to go to the market immediately to find 2, 3, 4, 8, 10 suppliers who will be able to deliver them. So this is where you sometimes also have a lot of input from senior management, because your contracted carriers have specific rates. Your spot carriers, because it's on the whim, their rates are sometimes above normal. So senior management is looking into it and looking at the impact of that spend onto their P&L. How does it impact the P&L? Yes, we may be selling, but it means the P&L, the profit margin is reduced because we went on a spot market. So it's very important that from a procurement standpoint, you advise senior management that up to 95, if not 100% of your contracts, of your relationship with your car transporters must be contracted. So you can lock in rates, and then you are safe, and then you can already project and forecast what the impact will be on the P&L. But on those rare occasions where you need to ramp up deliveries and you have to go on the spot, I'm happy to say that I've helped negotiate some of the most strategic negotiations in the automotive industry. When a few years ago, end of quarter companies, this organization was selling more cars, and so did not care about how much their sports carriers were charging. And when I came in, I said, well, prices are dipping, and you do not, as a sports carrier, determine how much you're going to charge us. So I did my market research. I used tools like an app. There's a tool called Apply, which gives you the cost per kilometer, etc. I did my tools. So I went to all the sports suppliers and I said to them, henceforth, on a quarterly basis, this is how much I am going to pay you. Are you interested or not? And this was 50% reduction in what they were previously charging. And I dare say that there were 30 of them, 28 of them said, we accept your rates. And everybody was baffled in my organization. I mean, baffled is a strong word. Everybody was shocked. And then they're like, how did that happen? I'm like, yes, because I am the owner of the cargo. Everybody wants to move my cargo. Everybody knows end of quarter, there's going to be volumes. So we are interested in that. So now that we had 28 suppliers all interested, we now decided to look at what was the performance of this carrier who was bullying us in the last 2 quarters because they have more trucks and said they will charge us this amount. Were they communicating? Were they showing proof of delivery? Were they delivering on time? Were they picking up by the need by date and delivering by the need by date? So we looked at their performance and now we decided, okay, we're not happy with the performance. Although you've accepted a 50% reduction, we're not happy with the performance last quarter. We're not going with you. It puts the power back in our hands to be able to determine who we want to deliver. And this is something that, when you have the buy-ins of senior management or you have buy-in of managers and leaders who give you the space to be able to take ownership, who give you the space to be able to be creative, to be able to be innovative and say that you are the subject matter expert in this domain, in this area. And so we trust you to be able to do what is right for the business in terms of cost saving, cost avoidance, because I've also gone in and negotiated rates from 30 days to 90 days, right? And I said, hey, this is the standard across the board. Are you interested? And it would amaze you that throw it to the suppliers and they'd accept it. But in the past, when organizations had money and they didn't care about what the contractual, I thought we need to standardize contracts versus having different rates in a contract. Because like you said, you spoke about AI. If I have over 100 suppliers and they all have different dates for terminating their contracts and different for renegotiating, and it's not standardized, I need to now go and read and look at what is the payment terms for supplier A is different from supplier B, different from supplier C. But if you standardize it across the board, you're just going in, let's hit the nail on the head. We know it's 90 days and then we move on to the next.
I'm still baffled. You mentioned the word yourself a while ago. I'm baffled by how complex this all is, right? It's very easy to sit here and to assume when you order something somewhere that I don't know, you call DHL and DHL takes care of it. But it's not the case. There are so many different moving parts, and this is really interesting. And I'm grateful for you to shedding a little bit of light on how this complicated process works. Now, Harry, if we zoom out a little bit further, I'm interested in some of your more personal reflections, right? Let's put the purely logistical aspects aside for a moment. You're pursuing an executive MBA at the University of Oxford, and your story, your background, you were certainly exposed to some transformative and transitionary moments. Do you have a personal framework or a methodology that you apply to make decisions for your own development?
Wow, that's an interesting question. And a lot of times I have a self-reflection when I look back 7, 8 years ago, this young, ambitious Ghanaian man or Ghanaian boy, let me put it that way. Um, I don't think I've got frameworks, but I think that my background has been more of sheer determination
Mhm.
and the willingness to pursue higher heights and greater heights. So I don't have a framework, but something that I was exposed to very early, like you mentioned about those transformations, is when I worked in freight forwarding as a young man. One of the key things I noticed was that for the organization or for one particular organization I worked for, the country managers were always very young people, but because they were nationals of where the organization came from, they came into Ghana as expatriates and they had all the soft life. So they had, fully furnished apartments with their drivers, day security, night security, everything taken care of. And this is how my ambition and dream started. So I said to myself, well, these guys are no better than me. The only difference between me and them is the fact that they are nationals of this country. And so this country, because the organization has a subsidiary or a local subsidiary, they bring these expatriates into the country. So it was that sheer determination that made me dream. So when I left General Electric, and I thought, how do I used to have a lot of recruiters reach out to me for roles within West Africa, but as someone from Ghana, I wasn't bilingual. I could get by with a little bit of French, but it wasn't really ideal. So I thought, let me relocate to a francophone country. I couldn't afford to relocate to Europe. I think the penultimate, in hindsight, would have been to come to France for like 3 months. So I went to Senegal to improve my French speaking skills. And while I was there, that was when I had the chance to be hired by Maersk. And, in the role, everybody speaks, I mean, it's a local Franco-French country. Everybody speaks French. But of course, it's an international organization. Everybody speaks English. And I was one in a million. And cultural differences, right? But then to be able to work alongside most of my colleagues in Maersk. Maersk was one of the most amazing things that happened to me in Senegal. And some of my very good friends I have made in the corporate space are from Maersk. So, as a young man, when you work in West Africa or when you work from Africa, your dream and ambition is to get into international levels. So, I applied for a role in Uber without knowing anyone. How did I apply? I used LinkedIn. So, I randomly saw a profile of a man whom I write and speak about almost every time. He was a logistics manager for Europe, Middle East, and he was a head of Europe logistics for head of Europe, Middle East, and Africa logistics at Uber. So I connect with him on LinkedIn and I send him a message and I say to him, "Hey, Dan, if you're looking for your next colleague, your next team member, I'm this young badass guy that you need on your team." And this is how plain direct I was. And then he responded back and said, "Hey, Harry, where in the world are you based? Would you like to stay in Ghana or would you want to?" And I said, "Hey, I want to come to the HQ. I want to come and have global perspective." And mind you, as a logistics professional back in Ghana, imagine I was shipping a lot to ports, Rotterdam port, to Hamburg. So, I was thinking, how do I come and see these things in their physical for real? So this man said to me, "I don't have any roles now. I could have some roles in 6 months." So I kept in touch with him. 6 months down the line, he had a role. I applied. Then one day he calls me and says, "I've got good news and I've got bad news." Well, the bad news is there's an internal candidate that also applied for the role that actually they thought was a good fit for the role. So they hired the internal candidate. The good news is the entire panel that you spoke with love you. So we made a decision that if the internal candidate moves into the new role, his role would become vacant. So instead of us opening that role, if you're interested, we could give you an offer. And I said, why not? And that was how my life was transformed by me being relocated from Senegal, then responsible for 7 countries, and I came to Europe where I managed over 45 countries in the EMEA region. So this is one of how my experiences got me out of my comfort zone. And then when I came in here, I also was determined that I need to get higher heights. So I pursued the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport. So I became a chartered member of CILT UK. I have just recently become a chartered professional with the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply. I've got my MSIPS certification. So then I decided 3 years ago, I was approached by McKinsey for their experienced hire role in their supply chain transformation business. And again, having worked in operations all my life, I didn't think I was that structured person who knew frameworks. So even though McKinsey guided me and supported me for 6 weeks to prepare for the interview, the role did not work out. But something, I call it failing forward. Something I learned from that experience, I decided that I have to go to a good business school. So I concluded on 2, INSEAD or Oxford. And everybody asked me, "Do you want to go into finance?" I said, "No, I don't want to go into finance. I still want to stay in supply chain, but I want to be that supply chain executive who has risen through the ranks." So now as a VP, so my future goal, VP supply chain strategy and transformation. Why? Because I want to be up there and work with a CFO and a CEO on how strategic our sourcing process must be, not just skewed to logistics, because now I'm challenging myself. Hey, I've been in logistics for so many years. I'm thinking, can I switch into CapEx and infrastructure? Huge spend into constructions or CapEx projects, machinery, or can I shift into R&D? R&D has a huge spend for lots of organizations, and how can I support them with their sourcing or procurement processes? Or can I go even into IT? How do we buy hardware? How do we buy software and negotiate them to be able to leverage, the Azures and the AWSs and you name it, SAPs, etc. So I think that it's just that shared determination. And also in looking back, I think I'm I feel like I'm an exception to the norm.
In what way are you an exception?
Well, when I say I'm an exception to the norm, it's just having ambition and asking for opportunities. Because a lot of times, the likelihood you're going to get a no is very high. But when I look at young Africans who look like me, or young people that look like me, I want to tell them, you don't need to know anyone anywhere. You just need to have a dream. You just need to have a drive, and you just need to pursue it. Right. So when I decided to go to Oxford, like I said, I thought I need to go to the best school in the world. And everybody kept asking me, how would you be able to manage it? Because the EMBA takes a lot of time. It's a lot of financial constraints, etc. And I keep saying that if it must be done, it must be done well. And I need to get to the apex of my career, knowing that I've done the operation, I've got a certification. When the VP level comes in, I can slowly and easily ease up into the position, well prepared.
But Harry, let me be provocative again. Many people have big dreams, including myself. It's easy to dream big. What makes how you think about it different?
It's easy to dream big, but it's how you pursue the dream. So the dream comes, yeah, we've got the dream. I want to be VP supply chain, but I'm not just sitting there just applying for roles. I'm creating relationships. I'm reaching out to people. I'm connecting with people that I think could be door openers for me and not gatekeepers, right? And that's why in the beginning, when you asked about coming from Ghana, now doing a lot of stuff in Europe, and I mentioned to you, it's actually very difficult to relocate or be hired as a skilled professional coming from where I come from and relocated to Europe. Because you cannot tell me there are no logistics and procurement people also based out of Europe. There's so many of them. But there must be something about you that would make a hiring manager say, I need that guy, and the organization would sponsor his work permit and visa and relocation, everything, and bring him into the country. It's the grit, it's the drive, it's the determination, it's the ambition, right? They should see the hunger, right? And I think it's the hunger that fuels the passion. And then with that passion, you decide to, do bigger things, do better things, and still pursue it. So, like you mentioned, everybody can dream, everybody dreams big, but a lot of times our lived experiences are very different. So, you come from Europe, your standard of living, your basic lifestyle standards are so normalized that they're not the same as maybe perhaps where I'm coming from. So you may think that if I work hard in the next 3 to 5 years based on where I am now, I should be able to get to that position I'm dreaming of. On the other hand, my lived experiences are different. So I may sometimes need to knock on doors. I may need to break down doors. I may need to tear down biases. I may need to ask, chase, prod before I can get to that point. So it's the differentiator for me, how I am able to pursue and knock and inspire the next generation to dream, to be ambitious, and motivate them as well. And this is just an aside, the number of resumes I help to review, the number of preparations for interviews that I help to speak about. Anyways, I know you had a question for me about my rejections from General Electric. When we get there, I'll also share a bit more light on that aspect.
You mentioned grit. How do you cultivate grit within yourself?
Yes. So how I cultivate grit within myself is I look at I don't look at the worst case scenario. I look at the best case scenario also. So when I say I don't look at the worst case scenario, the worst case scenario is one and one only. It's a no. You're not going to get the opportunity. But what is the best case scenario? What if I get that opportunity? What if I'm introduced to someone who introduces me to a primary connection? So that's where my grit comes from. Instead of looking at the worst case scenario, I'm always thinking about the best case scenario. It's why I mentioned about my failing forward. When McKinsey introduced me to prepare me for my interviewing that I didn't get through, I said, I need to go to a good business school. I need to shift my mindset. I need to think in a structured way. I need to think about frameworks, right? And I remember when I was preparing and I heard the first word, mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive. When I heard the MISI framework, which I'm sure you are used to. And, I had no idea what this was, but it has fueled some passion in me that I feel like, it's what gives the grit. The worst case scenario would always be the no. But the best case was I didn't go to McKinsey. I'm in Oxford.
Then let's actually talk about rejections as well, Harry, because it connects nicely to what you explained and also to how you cultivate grit. I'm certain that based on your trajectory, you've had to deal with rejections more than once. Can you take us through a specific example where you were exposed to rejections and what you do to get over it?
Well, just last week, you mentioned this. Last week, I was in an interview that I think I did great with a partner. The partner wanted me to meet an engagement manager and a global service delivery manager. First 30 minutes of the interview was amazing. And then we had to switch to the case. And then when we switched to the case, they gave me the case study. I gave it my best shot. And then maybe a couple of days later, I get an email from the HR team where they talk about how I interviewed very well, but the case wasn't structured as they wanted. And it really had a big impact on me, right? Because you think about the effort and the energy that you put in. But all in all, I've come to the realization that failure, rejection, and no's are part of the growth ecosystem or the growth life cycle, right? Because once you're rejected, you look at what are the learnings? What can I learn from this experience? And then how will this experience catapult me to the next level? So rejections, I normally tell people rejections are part of the equation. If you're applying for a job, if you're applying for school, whatever it is, there could be the rejection component. It should be there. So that's the worst case scenario. And that's why I mentioned that now I switched into the best case scenario where I'm like, there could be the possibility, but then I'm always thinking about, okay, just in case I get the role, what would I do? Do I need to relocate my family? How will that impact my work? How would that impact my school? How would that impact what I would learn in the executive MBA classroom and bringing it into the new job that I found? Will my new hiring manager and team buy into my passion and drive to going to school to be better? And how it could actually impact what we do on a daily basis. So in retrospect, I think that rejections fuel you and inflame the passion even more to say giving up is not an excuse.
Now, Ari, we covered a lot of ground, and I'm thankful that you also shared your personal reflections. What else is there that we should have talked about but didn't?
Well, I think, first of all, I love sharing my GE story about the 9 times in 2 years where I applied to General Electric and the 9 times that I was rejected and I got hired on the 10th application. And I say this because, like I said, this is where the grit comes from. Be saying that I'm not taking a no for an answer. I'm not accepting this rejection. But it also comes down to, and I need to be very frank here, we need to invest in ourselves, especially if you come from a historically marginalized or underserved community, or you are minority, whether I like it or yes, when I go back home, I'm majority. In Europe, I'm minority. So I encourage people all the time, invest in yourself. Now, when I was rejected 9 times within General Electric, on the 10th application, I'd actually done a training on dangerous goods. I mentioned the IATA, which is the International Association of Transport, International Air Transport Association, diploma on dangerous goods. So I applied for this role with GE for logistics specialist when GE Oil and Gas were starting their project in Ghana. And suffice to say that one of the requirements was you need to have IATA DG certification, which was great. But then I got an email one day that says, oh, the hiring manager would like to speak to you at this time, and the hiring manager never called me. So I followed up with an email and says, hey, I was waiting, but the call never came through. And then one day I was told, oh, well, you've been invited for an interview. So I have no idea. And I prepare and over-prepare for the interview. Basically, what I also did was I did a lot of research on the hiring manager, and I realized, oh, this hiring manager has lived in Angola. And as a logistics professional, Angola is one of the most complex countries to ship to. So I'm going into this interview where we are talking, and then he says, okay, Harry, let's be practical. Give us a time where you did A, B, C, D. How did you navigate through? Then I mentioned a story of when I shipped to Angola without waiting for some documentation in Angola and the repercussions. And that sets the hiring manager aflame because Angola is very complex. He had lived there for 2-3 years, and now the conversation shifted into Angola. And then I finished this interview. I walk away. Then 2 days later, I see that the role has been re-advertised.
Mhm.
And really, that was actually a big shocker to me because I thought I killed the interview. And then I get a call that evening, and the hiring manager says, well, there's good news and there's bad news. There's something about me with good news and bad news. He says, the bad news was that we got 6 resumes and we wanted to speak to 5 of them. And all of them come from oil and gas service companies. You're the only one that comes from an agency, like a third-party company that supports oil and gas service with their logistics. So HR mistakenly invited you to the interview. So when the hiring manager was coming to speak to me on that day, I was the last person where he was like, let me just go and speak to that guy that we shouldn't have invited. And then he came into the room, and then I brought this whole Angola edge and I brought my experiences. And then he said, this was a logistics specialist role. I've actually made it a senior logistics specialist. So the advert that we've opened is actually for you. Just send your CV through. You got the job. And so it's all about, it actually feels like a movie, right? But just the determination, be motivated enough to know that everything is possible if you put your mind to it.
Thank you for sharing the story. And Harry, I have good news and I have bad news for you now. The bad news is that we should slowly start wrapping up our conversation for today. The good news is there is a closing tradition on this podcast. And can you tell us, is there someone or something that is inspiring you right now, like a particular leader that you follow that you find inspirational, a book, an idea, or something else that is like expanding how you think?
Wow. That's an interesting question. If I would say that I have one person in mind, I think I get a lot of inspiration from my wife. So super sharp, super smart, super intelligent. I love her perspectives, and I think it's something that also drives me because I feel like, hey, I need to meet up the standard, right? So number one, and she's my number one cheerleader, encouragement, invest into me and everything. So really and truly, she's the number one that really inspires me a lot. But from a professional standpoint, I just think that I've seen a lot of young leaders that are doing transformational stuff. And I've seen how I inspire quite a lot of people also to be better versions of themselves. So I think that it's just a continuum cycling of, just doing something, knowing that it's it's impacting another generation who are inspired by me. So yes, my wife is my number one cheerleader. She's the one that drives me to do bigger and better things. And then, yeah, basically, I think that she's one of my biggest motivators.
Well, I hope that she listens to this episode.
I hope so too.
And Ari, if our listeners remember just one aspect from this conversation, one key idea or one way how they should consider thinking differently, what would you want that to be?
Wow, that's a very interesting one. I think I'll look at it from a logistics standpoint, right? Logistics gets as complex as it can get, right? A lot of times I keep asking myself, why am I in such a space? So if there's one thing to anyone listening to this podcast that I would love to leave with you, is I'd love to tell you that remember that you do not have control on a lot of things. And so some way, somehow, everything will fall in place. So take it a step a day at a time and you will be fine. At the end of the day, it would all fall in place.
Well, final words. Harry Davies, thank you very much for joining me on Business Unbound today. It was great to have you.
It's my pleasure, Florian, for having me on Business Unbound. And again, supporting you. Thank you for all you do. Thank you for bringing amazing leaders to share their stories to your audiences. I learn a lot from listening to your podcast also. So thank you for having me.
Thank you very much.